Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present the Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome to the Formed Book Club. We continue to discuss Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger's, then Benedict, Pope, Spirit of Liturgy. And we're on chapter 3 of part 2. Part 1 was on the essence of the liturgy. We discussed that. And in part 2, he talks about time and space in liturgy. Chapter 1, time. Chapter 2, sacred places. And now comes what I think is the central chapter of this whole book. And I'm afraid I'm going to dilate on it at great length. The altar and the direction of liturgical prayer. This, I think, is the definitive research and reporting on the direction of prayer and the altar. So I'm going to, especially, we had a nice lunch here. My Cabernet was superb. I thought I just have it. My sourdough bread was not perfect, but it was plenty good enough for the wine. So you're going to have to interject, interrupt, intervene at any time when you feel so called. So chapter 3, page 74 in my book, 86 or 88 in, I think, other books. You always look at the beginning of the he's a great professor. He explains what he's going to do. The reshaping so far described of the Jewish synagogue for the purpose of Christian worship. So that's an origin of Christian Catholic worship. Clearly shows, as we already said, how even in the architecture, there's both continuity and newness in the relationship of the Old Testament to the New. This is a very important concept, both for theology and for liturgy, that Jesus is the fulfillment and the surpassing of the prophecies and the liturgical expression of the Jewish people. And so we expect to find it organically united to what went before, and at the same time, we expect to find something which is new. As a consequence, expression in space had to be given to the properly Christian act of worship, the celebration of the Eucharist, together with the ministry of the Word, which is ordered to that celebration. So, 2 parts of the Mass, the Word, the Eucharist. The first is oriented to the second. 8 lines up from the bottom there. We saw that the architectural canon for the liturgy of the Word and sacrament is not a rigid one. Though with every new development and reordering, the question has to be posed, here we are again, what is in harmony with the essence of the liturgy and what detracts from it? So that's what he's going to do. He's going to look about the altar and ask himself, it's not rigid, there's flexibility, there can be change, but what corresponds most perfectly to the essence of the liturgy and what detracts? Next page. Can foretell us what he's going to do in this chapter. Despite all the variations in practice that have taken place far into the second millennium, one thing has remained clear for the whole of Christendom, and that means East and West, right? Praying toward the East is a tradition that goes back to the beginning. Moreover, it is a fundamental expression of the Christian synthesis of cosmos and history, of being rooted in the once-for-all events of salvation history, cross and resurrection especially, while going out to meet the Lord who is to come again. New paragraph, just that first sentence. Modern man has little understanding of this, quote, orientation, close quotes. So there we set the scene for what he's going to do. Next page, 76 or 90. 6 lines down or so. The cosmic symbol of the rising sun expresses the universality of God above all particular places and maintains the concreteness of divine revelation. So it's cosmic, but it's also concrete. It's a specific direction towards a specific star. Now comes the question, next paragraph. But what about the altar?
Father, can I intervene?
Yes.
Yeah, because I highlighted the very following sentence to one you just read, because it just struck me as something new for me. Our praying is thus inserted into the procession of the nations to God. And I just had this vision of, we're all facing the same way, but we're actually moving forward. So whether in the 2nd century or the 12th century or the 21st century, that orientation during the Mass is actually moving the people of God in the direction of the resurrected and Lord and the second coming. So there's this sort of dynamism in the movement, which I hadn't really thought about before.
Yes. Next sentence there. Well, I just read that. Okay, what direction? On the next page, just above the middle. Oh, well, at the very bottom phrase on page 76/90, sacrifice is humanity becoming love with Christ.
Yeah,
now,
beautiful.
What a beautiful poetic expression that is.
Yeah, beautiful.
And it sums up what he said previously about egressus and regressus, exitus and reditus, and the Mass being the turning point. We bring with Christ crucified and risen the whole of creation and ourselves back to God. Next page, just above the middle, the liturgical renewal in our own century, he's talking about the 20th century now, took up this alleged model. The alleged model of St. Peter's, because St. Peter's, if you've been there, it actually faces west. And there's that beautiful alabaster window of the Holy Spirit that's in the back of the apse, in which the setting sun illuminates with these beautiful colors. So people say, oh, well, look, the church doesn't face east, it faced west. Well, he's going to explain what the problem was. Took up this alleged model and developed from it a new idea for the form of liturgy. The Eucharist, so it was said, had to be celebrated versus populum, toward the people. The whole rest of that paragraph is good, but let's go to the next page, 78/92. This is, of course, he says, a misunderstanding of the significance of the Roman Basilica and the positioning of its altar, and the representation of the Last Supper is also, to say the least, inaccurate. So this idea that we have to conform the Mass to what we think the Last Supper was is, he'll explain later in this chapter, inaccurate. Next page, 4 lines down. This the Christian, new and all-encompassing form of worship could not be derived simply from the meal, but had to be defined through the interconnection of the temple and the synagogue, word and sacrament, cosmos and history, a repeated refrain. But we'll see in this chapter, he explains, yes, this Eucharist is a meal, but it's a sacred meal. It's a unique type of meal, and we can't make the form of the Eucharistic sacrifice be imitative of the form of a meal, even though the Jewish meal, as we'll see later, had a little different form than we would expect a normal supper to have. A few lines down there, he says, once again, let me quote Bouillet. Father Louis Bouillet was a French oratorian, former Lutheran, became a Catholic, and then a priest. Extraordinary person. He came into San Francisco every year for a while to teach our students. And he was just a treasure of wisdom and knowledge of the church, and especially of liturgy. And also a fairly mordant sense of humor about a liturgist especially. But here's what Boyer says. Never and nowhere before that is before the 16th century, which is Luther and the Reformation, have we any indication that any importance or even attention was given to whether the priest celebrated with the people before him or behind him. As Professor Cyril Vogel has recently demonstrated, that's another liturgist of the 20th century, very important person. The only thing ever insisted upon or even mentioned was that he should say the Eucharistic prayer as all the other prayers facing east. So whether he faced the people or not, that was insignificant. The point was when he prayed, he faced east. Even when the orientation of the church enabled the celebrant to pray turned toward the people when at the altar, we must not forget that it was not the priest alone who then turned east. It was the whole congregation together with him. So you got St. Peter's Basilica, okay? It's facing west. So there's an altar, and the priest is facing west at the altar, but he faced east for the it's for the word of the God and everything. But then for the Eucharistic sacrifice, he's on the west side of the altar, facing the people who are in the east side of the nave, but they've got their backs turned toward him because they're facing east also. So this idea that St. Peter's Basilica is the basis for Mass versus Populum is simply absurd. And Ratzinger is pointing that out here.
Father, a couple of things, if I may. I mean,
please interrupt. I love interruptions.
Well, on page 91, he does say in parentheses here about versus populum. I think it's important for people to know this, that the council, the Second Vatican Council, says nothing about turning towards the people. So this isn't something which is the teaching of the Second Vatican Council. This is an innovation in the so-called alleged spirit of, which is not the same thing as we've said repeatedly. And then what you said briefly, that this first quote by Louis, is it Bouyer? Is that how you pronounce his name?
Bouyer, yes. Yeah.
Is just this, again, this idea of everybody in the meal, Last Supper, and in ancient meals all be on the same side of the table, and the other side is where the servers were. So there's not even a versus populum in the idea of the meal. So it's just wrong-headed on all counts.
So, Father, explain to me, if you would please, when you say that when the celebration of the Mass in St. Peter's Basilica gets to the Eucharistic prayer, the priest is facing east, and so was the practice originally that the people turned east also? Did they turn around?
That's the expression. Conversi ad Dominum. What happened would be, at the first part of the Mass, of course, the priest or the Pope or the bishop is facing the people, doing the readings, giving the homily. And the people are facing the priest, and then they're having the response, whatever that might be, the gradual, the response of some, I'm not sure what they had then. But in any event, at that point, when the gifts are brought up, the priest or the Pope receives the gifts, the deacon sings, Conversi ad Dominum. Time to turn to the Lord. And all the people turned and faced the entrance of St. Peter's. And the Pope or the bishop was on the west side of the altar facing with them. So, it's an interesting, I never thought about it until I read it here, but interesting image,
He became the caboose.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and this is years ago, someone sent us a book. It was actually a Protestant publication, a series of history books, and they were pretty well done. But there was one on the Crusades, and when the Crusaders, the Franks as they were called in the Holy Land there, had conquered temporarily, they lived for long periods of time in kind of collaboration with Muslims because there are people there, they're selling their grain or whatever, and the Crusaders would allow Muslims to come into the Catholic cathedrals or churches to pray. Well, there's an actual account, and it was actually quoted there, of this Frankish, the kind of a rough-hewn crusader comes into the chapel, and there's a Muslim there praying, but he's facing Mecca, which would be to the south. And the priest said, wait a minute, you can't pray that way. I got to pray this way. I got to face Mecca. No, you can't, not our chapel. You got to pray facing east. And so the crusader picked him up and turned him east. It was a friendly struggle that took place. But to me, that really brought home the idea that up until the Middle Ages and beyond, it was just not conceivable to think of official prayer being made anywhere other than towards the rising sun. Bottom of page 79. Go ahead, Joseph. You had something else?
No, that's it.
Bottom of page 79, last line. In reality, what happened after the council was that an unprecedented clericalization came on the scene. Now the priest, the presider, as I know to call him, becomes the real point of reference for the whole liturgy. Everything depends upon him. We have to see him, to respond to him, to be involved in what he is doing. His creativity sustains the whole thing. So, and I want to comment on this word presider. Why is that become a very common term to refer to the celebrant of the Mass? Because it's more abstract than celebrant. And it's of the liturgy, not of the Mass. Presider at the liturgy. Baptism is a liturgy also. And even an atheist can baptize as long as he intends what the church intends. And a child can baptize someone else, and a woman can, and a Muslim can. And so, theoretically, if you talk about sacraments of baptism as a sacrament, a woman can be the presider at the baptismal liturgy. Because now we've made liturgy more abstract. It includes all the sacraments, and presider more abstract. It includes both the minister of baptism and of the Eucharist. And so they want to call the priest a presider precisely to confuse things, make it ambiguous, so that they don't recognize that only someone who is ordained a vir male, can be the consecrator, presider, proclaimer of the word at an official Eucharist. So that, again, it's part of as my former, well, he's a friend all his life, but he died years ago, Monsignor Bill Smith was fond of saying, he said, social engineering is always preceded by linguistic engineering. We're terminating the pregnancy. Really? How about killing a baby?
Yeah.
All right.
The other thing there, Father's right. I think there's an irony here because that Ratzinger points out that this abuse of the liturgy is actually clericalism. Because it's always the sort of the claim is that sort of the church was clericalist and now we're not. But the actual fact, the priest becomes the star of the show. Everyone's pointing to the priest. You get the crucifix out of the way so the priest can be seen. To me, this is clericalism taken to an extreme. And again, the irony, the double think is that those who are more traditional are accused of being clericalist, which actually is the opposite.
And I love the symbolism as I'm vesting as a priest that after the amice, I put on the alb, which is white garment, reminds of baptism. I'm entering into my baptismal experience of Christ. Then comes the cincture, a strengthening, a prayer for chastity, which is confirmation, strengthening, a sacrament. Then comes the stole, which is elevation to the sacrament of holy orders, the ministry. And finally, the chasuble, which is Christ the high priest. So I'm disappearing, And when I turn to face the Lord, the people can't see my face. They see my back, and they see on the back of the vestments, usually a picture of Christ or Christ. We mentioned that last session, I think. So that I'm disappearing. I'm growing less. Christ is growing more. And I just think that it's not a sin. It's not, even a fault necessarily. But Mass facing the people emphasizes the person of the priest, not the person of Christ.
I was actually
Anyway.
thinking, Father, it's sort of like the reversal of till we have faces. That if the priest is facing you, particularly at the elevation and things like that, it's very difficult to see this particular person who you probably know as being in persona Christi, right? Because he's elevating the host right in front of his face. So it's very difficult to sort of separate the two. Where if he has his back to you and he's elevating the host, it's very easy that the in persona Christi thing is much easier to unite yourself with if you're not seeing the face of the human priest that you know.
Yeah, and I'm very aware of this. In fact, when I was first ordained, 1972, we already had mass facing people and so on. And I just intuitively felt there's something wrong here. I don't want to be looking at you. You're looking at me. We want to be looking at the Lord. And I was just a thought that through my mind. But I celebrated 10,000 masses, I believe, versus Poplar, and quite a few thousand of them with folk music as well. But actually, Vivian, it was when your boys came to serve my mass at the chapel over at USF, University of San Francisco, that the first thing we did was, because they were dressed nicely, but they just had little, their pants on and a shirt and everything. And then somehow we thought, let's add some chant. We added the Kyrie, and then the Sanctus. And all of a sudden, it occurred to us, wait a minute, we need more formality. So we get little castics, and little surplices to Stephen and Thomas. I still have a great picture of me and Thomas there in my room there. And then, once we did that, we said, this chapel is a little too comfortable. You're going to have rug on it and these chairs like a hotel lobby. And that's when we went across the street to the Carmelites, because we realized there was something more here that we were missing by the informality that had come in after the council and with the new mass.
Now, actually, I hadn't thought about it as well, Father, because I've not been a priest ever. That, of course, it's at least the same for the priest. Now, you have to turn away from the sacrifice of the mass, face towards the people. Right now, you have an audience in front of you. Even if you don't want to see it as such. So it's going to be very difficult for the priest to, if you like, keep himself lost. Out of things when he's turning and looking at this host, the sea of faces in front of him. So yeah, I hadn't seen it that way round. I hadn't orientated myself from the perspective of the priest because I've never been a priest, but I can see that you turn around and here you are now confronted with this host, right, of a different sort.
Yes, and I'm very conscious of that. And I realize that as a priest, I'm there not for myself. I'm there for the community, and to praise the Lord with them together. But as soon as I began celebrating Mass ad Orientem, I could pray while I celebrated Mass. I mean, I don't want people looking at me while I pray, you know what I mean? But now they can't see me praying. I'm praying, and they're praying. I can't see them. So it's much more intimate in a certain sense to do it that way. By the way, I want to. I always want to absolve myself and excuse myself and exculpate myself for various things. I mean, I'm half Italian and a quarter French, so I tend to be emotional about things, I suppose. And I get emotional and I begin to speak louder and so on about liturgical things. But so part of the exculpation is I'm a Mediterranean type. But the second part is there's very few times when Jesus got angry in the Gospels. But one of them was in the temple when it was become secularized, when he had the money changers there, and the doves. And what did meek and mild Jesus do? He picked up these cords and get that picture in your mind, The temple is a huge place. He's driving them out. Why? My Father's house is a house of prayer.
Amen.
Okay. So let's see. Middle of that page 80. 94 in your books. The turning of the priest toward the people has turned the community into a self-enclosed circle. In its outward form, no longer opens out on what lies ahead and above, but is closed in on itself. I mean, one thing I like about him is what he means when he's writing. He's very clear.
This is related also. Joseph mentioned the clericalization element. Well, there's also been a clericalization of laity who now have been brought in to fulfill all of these roles in the Mass. And so now you do have the sense of not only the priest being a performer, but also these other people. What do? They end up becoming like a performance troupe. And then talk about closed circles. So now you have kind of like this inner circle that's closed, and then this outer circle of those of us who are the spectators. I mean, it's just all wrong, no matter how you. And it all happened when that priest turned around.
Yeah, and I'm not opposed to lay people taking a role in the liturgy more than they had in the past, but to think that that's a more active, a more intimate association with the Mass, that is false. I think about the mother who can't be a lector. She's got to feed the kids, at home, take them to Mass. One of them's crying. She's in the crying room. Is she not participating? Is she somewhat second class because she's not a greeter, or Eucharistic minister of some kind? No, that's completely false. I knew this chapter was going to take some time. Why don't we conclude it here and take it up next week or next session? And that would give people something to wait for and be interested in. Is that good?
Sounds good.
That's good.
We'll come back next week with the rest of this chapter. Thanks. God bless you all.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.